everyone, we are back with yet another episode of Superannuated Starman. This is episode 43, and I am Sean Ryan. Today I'm joined by Cory Braucks.
Buongiorno, citizens!
Chris is out this week due to some family stuff that came up, so we're postponing the Ace Attorney episode until he can join us. But because of that, Cory and I are going to be discussing Bomberman GB for the original Game Boy. This suggestion comes from Cory himself, and I don't know much about this game, so all of this is brand new to me. With that in mind, it's going to be a very short episode, so let's take a break, listen to some music, and when we come back, we'll discuss the history of this game. Not to be confused with the Japanese Bomberman GB, which was released as Wario Blast, featuring Bomberman in North America and Europe. Bomberman GB is the second game in Japan's Bomberman GB series. Here today, we will be talking about the North American version of Bomberman GB that I'm just going to call GB hereafter. Developed by Hudson Soft, the game had several different publishers depending on the region it was released in. In Japan, it was published by Hudson Soft, Nintendo in North America, and lastly, Virgin Interactive in Europe. GB was released in North America on April 10th, 1998, and the same year in the month of May across Europe. The game also had a Japanese-only sequel that released in December of 1996. Our game starts off with a Bomberman archaeologist named Indy Bomber as he attempts to recover a lost legendary artifact known as the Ring of Wishes. While reading some newly discovered scripture that might aid him in his quest, the ground beneath him gives away, causing him to fall into the caverns below that are filled with monsters. Now he must defeat these enemies and escape the caves, all the while fulfilling his mission of obtaining the Ring of Wishes. The game is divided into 8 levels, each level further divided into several stages, with the goal of defeating the enemies in each stage by placing a bomb that will explode in a north, east, southwest, or up, down, left, right pattern. There are 2 different modes that can be selected before each new stage, Mode A, which requires the player to defeat all enemies, and Mode B, which requires the player to defeat those enemies in a specific order. After beating a level, Indy gains a new ability to aid him in the upcoming stages. This is one of the few Game Boy games that can support up to 4 players with the usage of the Game Link cable if playing with 3 other friends that have a copy of the game, or by using the multi-tap if playing the game using a Super Game Boy on the SNES. And because I'm trying to stretch this out and fill some time here, I'm going to briefly talk about the history of Bomberman as a whole. The first release of Bomberman takes us all the way back to Japan in July of 1983 when it was released on the MSX alongside other home computers, but the beginnings of Bomberman actually go back to 1980 when a simplistic version of the game was written for Hudson Soft's BASIC compiler to serve as a tech demo. The lore, if you can call it that, has been retconned several times over the years and has branched out into other stories involving other Bomberman. But the overall basic premise is that the player is usually deep underground and must escape to the world above. In the original releases, after Bomberman has reached the surface after defeating 50 levels, he turns into a generic human. But in the NES and Famicom versions of the game, after clearing the final stage, it's revealed that the game is a prequel to Lode Runner by Hudson Soft, and our Bomberman turns into the unnamed protagonist from that game. From its humble beginnings as a tech demo, the Bomberman franchise has been going on for 40 years and continuing with dozens of titles spanning across just as many systems, with the latest release being Super Bomberman R2, available on the Switch, PS4, PS5, and the Xbox One family. With that out of the way, Cory, unless you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, so you talked about how this has like co-op actually. Did you put in the code to open up the battle arena?
No, I did not know there was a
Yeah, so
code
this
like
game
that.
uses a password system. I don't believe we've mentioned that yet. So there's no save files, but one of the passwords that you can input is I think 5656, and it opens up like a little battle arena version of the game. So what happens is that you can assign players to the different Bomberman sprites, and anyone that's not available, so if you only have like one friend playing or two friends playing, you can turn them on to computer mode. You can actually go completely against the computers as well if you want. And what it does is it puts you like in a little battle arena similar to Mario Kart almost. And you play on this little stage, and you can basically set it up where you'll have 1 to 4 players, and you can join with your friends and fight against each other. And if you don't have enough people, the rest of the Bombermen basically will be computers. And it's a little like fighting arena where you try to blow each other up. And it's just a fun little like side thing that they put in there.
I'm glad that you mentioned the password system because that does play into my playthrough later on. But for now, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to hear about Cory's memories of this Game Boy title.
All right, and we're back. So Sean did not play this one, sadly, but this was one of the titles that I had as a child, and I had it on the Game Boy. And I had one of those teal Game Boy colors with like the big bump on the back end of them. And I think this is probably one of the I don't know, I probably had about a dozen titles. I mean, I definitely had Pokemon. I had another weird game I can't remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So, oh, Small Soldiers too. I had that one, but so I Bomberman actually was a really fun title because it does lend to this very easy pick up and play style where there's a password system, so you can just kind of write down where you were if you left off, or if you died you can always just take that password down and you can try to jump back in at a later date. So I played this a lot as a kid. This was something you could play, and you could kind of do this for like a half hour if you were waiting for something, or if like you were, getting ready for bed or whatever, you wanted to kill some time. So I vividly recall playing this like in the car, like on the way to places, or like if I was just kind of winding down for the day. It was just it's a really like straightforward title. It's deceptively easy in my opinion, and it's just a really fun game.
So I have played Bomberman games in the past, and I can't really say I'm a fan of the series because I'm really not, but it is fun to play versus modes against friends, but it was just never really my thing. Like I've gone to birthday parties and played Bomberman on the Sega Saturn. Like I remember doing all that, but I don't really have anything against the franchise. I just never got into it. I'm familiar with it, but I've never played this game, and in fact, I've never even heard of it until you brought it up.
One of the things I think that might draw people away from it is that it does very much feel like an old school Atari game almost. It's really straightforward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it honestly reminds me of a game that I owned for the Game Boy called Snoopy's Magic Show, which the gameplay is just very, very different from Bomberman as it is. And instead, in Snoopy's Magic Show, you're Snoopy, and instead, there's just these little like balls that are just going around the screen. You just don't want to be hit by them. The gameplay makes no sense and has nothing to do with the Peanuts franchise, but it just seems like everybody had one of these filler games in their Game Boy collection. It was just a puzzle game that really wasn't all that much.
Right. And I think one of the coolest things about this game to me is the fact that as you continue to play through the campaign, you do end up getting all these little benefits. So like when you beat the first level, you get a whip, so you can like push the bombs away from you, and then you get like a dash, and then you get like a mechanic to like drop all your bombs at once. And like I think that did kind of increase the staying power, replayability for me, as the fact that like the further you push yourself, like the more interesting little like side unlock power ups you get. So that was always like a cool thing in my opinion. And I don't know if like the earlier titles had anything like that.
I honestly can't speak to that because I don't remember playing them. And the last Bomberman title that I think I played was on the N64. But I do like what you had mentioned about the fact that you get more power-ups or more abilities as you go on. That Snoopy game that I mentioned, it's the same thing throughout. Like you are not expanding your kind of bag of tricks like you do in this game.
So like I said, it was just a really fun little, easy to play title, and we were looking for something short to be a filler episode this week. So I thought this was just a kind of a fun one to revisit. But I think that's all I've got for childhood memories.
And I think it was a great suggestion. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about my modern day playthrough. So stick around and enjoy this music. Welcome back, everybody. So, playing the game today, I played this on my modded Game Boy Advance, courtesy of Cass from Button Masher Mods. And I'm going to add those links in the description. She's not sponsoring this episode. She just does amazing work. And I really want to mention that because I love my Game Boy Advance. It's amazing. And having a backlit screen just really adds to the experience. There's also something about just playing on real hardware, though if I were really playing it right, I'd be playing on a DMG Game Boy, but the one I found doesn't work and I can't find my modded one, so the Game Boy Advance it is. All in all, I probably spend around 5 hours on this game, dying and getting game overs, and it's nice that it has that password system that you mentioned, but I wanted to beat this game in one go, and it took me a bit over 2 hours from start to finish, and I've got to say, it's pretty darn good. It's challenging and frustrating at times because it seems like it becomes a waiting game until you understand the game's mechanics a little better. So, when destroying some of the blocks or barriers, you'll find power ups that either extend the length of your bomb's blast or allow you to place multiple bombs at a time. And one of the things that was irritating to me at first was that I felt like it took too long to blow up some of the bombs that I'd placed around, but I discovered that you can chain them together. So if your blast radius is long enough to come into contact with another bomb, it'll blow up all at the same time. And if you plan things out well enough, you can maximize the amount of time you have. That'll be much more important later on as you get the levels that become more and more complex. So they add in things like switches that have to be bombed to open up specific areas.
Well, cut you off here real quick. Even as early as like the first boss, I think making like the L shape with your bombs is probably one of the most like effective ways to keep your distance from the boss as well as making sure that you're going to hit him.
You mentioned the boss rush, but just the fact that there are bosses in this puzzle game. Yeah, there's monsters and everything, but it felt like such a complete experience that there were bosses that I had at the end of each full level.
Yeah, the fact that they're bosses and they're actually different from each other, I think is probably the most impressive thing about this. Because it is a very straightforward game, right? You lay the bombs down, they blow up, you do damage. And the fact that you have these bosses that will throw things at you, or they'll like kind of teleport around the room, or they'll spawn little ads out. I think most of them spawn an ad out. Um, I think it's very entertaining that they managed to put so much variety into this.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned before, there are not perks, but you become stronger. You have more in your arsenal after each level. There is progression to it. Like you said, one of the first actually the first thing you get is Indy's whip that will smack a bomb in the direction you're facing until it hits a wall. And this becomes vital later on when your blast radius can sometimes get so big that you need to get out of the area in a hurry. And with all the monsters on the board, sometimes they're just coming at you very, very fast. So you have to just kind of push things out of the way and move. And I mentioned this to you off air, but I really enjoyed the music. It's repetitive for sure, which is expected for a Game Boy title because there's just not a lot of space on the cart, but it's good enough that I didn't mind hearing it over and over again after dying on my multiple playthroughs that first time around when I was trying to figure the game out.
Yeah, it's catchy, but it's not like intrusive, I think is the best way to think about it.
That's a great way to putting it because it is just something that fills the background, but you do find yourself humming it later on, especially that first world or stage. Yeah. That music is so good and it just gets better as you go on. In fact, I think stage 7 has my favorite music of all of it, but you'll definitely be hearing it here. But I don't have a whole lot to talk about this game because I just kind of wrote very generic notes because I was focusing my time on playing and getting through this game. So, Corey, why don't you jump in and tell me what it was like to play Bomberman GB today?
Guys, I'm not good at video games. I definitely, you mentioned that you did this in one run through. I definitely used the password system. I probably played, I would say about the same amount of time. It was somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 hours. And I pretty much just wrote down like whatever password I had after playing for like a half hour to crack until I finally got through with all of this. The game is still pretty hard. And it's a very simple, straightforward, easy game when you look at it. And even if you watch somebody play it, it's like, oh yeah, I could do that. However, it requires patience and timing. And those are two things I think we all know at this point that I do not have. So I constantly find myself like running away from a bomb that I dropped like a half second too early, or I put a bomb down and I push the button. Like I'm running and I drop a bomb while I'm running, and I meant to go one direction and I trap myself in a corner and I blow myself up that way. So there's just a lot of ways to just kind of accidentally kill yourself, and I found myself doing that quite a bit.
For sure, and that's what took me a few hours to kind of get the rhythm of the game down. And as you go on, the enemies become a little bit more complex, and like you said, the stages become more complex. There's a point, I can't remember which stage it is, but there will be these faces in the walls and they will stick their tongue out.
That's the like sixth, I think. It's like that weird temple level.
Yeah, it's further on in the game, and it just becomes such a pain when dealing with those things because like you said, you have to really time your bombs, and you could easily kill yourself if you're not paying attention, or you can get trapped by an enemy. It's too easy to die in this game, but like you said, with patience, it becomes very doable.
And you mentioned the tongue guy. one of the things you talked about in the beginning, but you really didn't go into too much detail about, is that every stage has an A mode and a B mode. And the first level, it's either a timer or it's do you blow up X number of monsters to progress, right? And as the levels continue, those A modes and B modes change. So it gets to the point where, by like the third level, it's like, okay, well, you have these switches now. Do you like flip all the switches off to get through the level, or do you have the on-off mechanic where you can turn them on and off, and it will put up barriers for you that you can use to your advantage, but also might block you in if you're not paying attention.
It was honestly really surprising to see how much was put in this game that I can't imagine was anything more than like a budget title back in the day.
Yeah, and as you said, I think a regular playthrough, if you guys know what you're doing and you're doing this in one shot, probably takes in the range of 2 to 2.5 hours. So it's not a particularly long game. It does have a lot of stages. There's, I think, 7 stages, and there's 5 levels per stage. So that's what, 35 stages. So there is quite a bit of variety in terms of gameplay, but it's not like any of these stages takes more than 2 minutes to clear. So it is a pretty fast thing if you're gonna like one shot it all, but it's a lot of effort.
And having that password system does mean that you can come back to it. You don't have to blast through the game like I did. I just wanted to do that really because you've got Contra under your belt, and I'll never reach those heights. But I remember us talking about that, and I was like, you know what? I want to do my one shot, my one CC playthrough here.
And I mean that it is a good title to do because, like I said, this game it's not as easy as it looks by any stretch of the
No,
imagination.
no, absolutely not. It gets very challenging in those later stages.
And so let's look through the power ups. You've got the whip mechanic, right? That's the first thing you unlock, and then is the next one dash?
I honestly don't remember the order in which you get them, but like you mentioned, you have the ability to drop all of your bombs simultaneously, is another one. Are you pulling up the list right now?
I don't even know if I can find a list. Like this game is not there's not a lot of info out there as far as I could tell. A lot of it, especially because Bomberman GB shares the same name as like the Japanese version. And so when you type in Bomberman GB, you get a lot of like the WarioWare Japanese stuff.
Yes, and that became a problem for me. And in fact, this is just extra for anybody else out there, but when I was putting the episode stuff together, I asked Corey, I was like, hey, which box art do you want to use? And one of them had the Indiana Jones inspired Bomberman, and the other one was a Bomberman riding a motorcycle. And he's like, look, I have no idea what that is. And at the time, I didn't know that they were two separate games. So I had to do a little bit of research on my own to figure that out.
Yeah, Sean showed me that, and he like put the box art in Discord, and I was like, dude, I didn't even know there were two box arts. And then come to find out, it's the same title but like a completely different game. And then the version that we're playing is like Bomberman 2 in Japan or whatever.
Yeah, so the title screen in the Japanese version is exactly the same, except it has a large number two on it. Because, like I mentioned earlier, in Japan, that first game is known in North America as Wario Blast featuring Bomberman. So that's the story behind that.
That's so wild.
It really doesn't make a lot of sense for them to have just completely renamed it for the North American release. Why not just have its own? I don't, who knows? Nintendo doesn't make a lot of sense with all the things that they've done when you consider, like, we talked about Star Fox being the Lilac Wars in Europe.
Yeah, just completely different names in different
Yeah, things that
regions.
just don't make sense at all. But I think we've talked a lot about our replay, unless you have more that you wanted to go into.
I really like the motorcycle. Did you enjoy the motorcycle?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So by the end of the game, I think it's the last power up you get. You get a cool motorcycle, which basically makes you sprint permanently, and then it also gives you like a free hit. So if you get struck, normally you die. There's no life system in this game. Um, and then when you get the motorcycle, it's basically like you have two chances to pass through a level now without dying. And then after that, you get like the mega bomb power up before you get into the boss rush, where you get like max power on all your bombs and all of your supply. Because there's like two sets of power ups. There's X number of bombs you can drop and how strong they are, which is like how many tiles the bomb will explode to, in terms of length. And so you get like the maximum setup before the boss rush. And then the boss rush is like the bosses 1 through 7, I think, are the normal ones. And then you get to the cheap one at the end, which makes you want to pull your teeth out. So I think that's pretty much what covering the game in its entirety is that.
And I want to clarify something you said when you said that there's no, I think you said life system. There are lives, there's a life counter, but there's no health for
Oh yeah,
Bomberman. Like,
there's no hit
yeah, it's a one
points.
shot, one kill kind of deal, with the exception of getting the motorcycle.
Yes, there's 2 lives before you have to like use your continue with your password, basically. And there are infinite continues. So if you die, like you pretty much just kind of step back to where you were. So there's not really too big of a penalty in that part. That being said, like by the fifth boss or whatever, I was I was resetting that continue thing pretty frequently.
But the game is very forgiving overall. Like you said, you have unlimited continues and you don't really have to worry about playing this game in one sitting. You can come back to it.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons probably why I beat it as a kid, because if I were to try to do this in one go, I would have been incredibly frustrated, I'm sure.
You know, it's wild that something like this has a password system and you can come back to it, whereas games like Super Mario Brothers 3, the original on the NES, that didn't even have a battery system.
It's crazy how like games have evolved, and even Super Mario in particular, that's not a it's not an arcade game, right? So like you expect games that are like arcade titles to not have a save system or a password system. Like Super Mario 3 is like a solid multi-hour title, and it's kind of just like either you beat it in one or you're just stuck. Like, oh, okay.
And we definitely have to cover that game at some point, but I think we've got all out that we're going to of this playthrough. So are you ready to move on, or was there anything else you wanted to add?
Nope, that's good.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to take our last break. And when we come back, we're going to come back with our final thoughts on the game Bomberman GB for the Game Boy. All right, welcome back, everybody. This is our last segment, our final thoughts. So, all in all, it's a Bomberman game. If you don't like Bomberman, you're not going to like this title. But I went from someone that was pretty lukewarm about the entire franchise to being curious about some of the other games in the series. So, thank you, Corey, because I'll be checking out more games because of this suggestion.
Yeah, and just to jump on to things, I don't know what the other Bombermen are like really. I don't have too much experience with the franchise myself, but the fact is that like this one had this little campaign mode, and it had enough variety where I have very fond memories of this title.
And I can totally understand why, because it is a very charming game. There isn't much to the story. It's very simplistic. It is a Game Boy title, but at least it has a story and you have multiple modes of playing. And like he said, it's not so punishing that you have to play this game in one sitting. You can come back to it through the password system, or you can keep using those continues if you just really want to power through this. Corey, is there anything else that you have before we close out this show?
Yeah, I mean, usually we give our final thoughts here. Um, I really like this title. I think it's just this charming little distraction, and I'm not expecting a lot from it, so I think that's why it's just this wonderful little thing that we can have. And in modern day terms, I really wish this is something that they would put on a phone, because it's a two button system. It's something that could be very easily put on a touch screen, and I I think this is just kind of one of those wonderful things that we lost in terms of just being able to slip a Game Boy into your pocket and kind of go around town or whatever. It's just a fun little thing, and I enjoy it.
And I enjoyed it a lot too. So again, thank you for that suggestion.
All right, guys. Phoenix Wright is still on the books. We're looking at maybe another week or two before we can get that recorded. So stay tuned for that. And this is Superannuated Starman.